kind of the dire circumstances that people live in Gaza, the killing of children, obviously in Israeli airstrikes, but also just the broader, what's going on here? There is, the old talking points about, supporting a two-state solution just don't ring true anymore. And I think in the Democratic Party, people who actually, I think a couple of things happened. I mean, one is just frustration with Bibi because, over the last decade, he's basically embraced fully Trump, the Republican Party, worked against the Democratic Party. I think frustration with the circumstances faced by the Palestinians, but also I think, as there's been this new activist generation that has kind of regenerated the Democratic caucus in the House. These are people who basically their politics is about structural inequity in this country and around the world. And the Palestinian issue fits very neatly into that worldview. And so I think there's a lot of reasons why the trend lines are, that we saw in the recent Gaza conflict are going to continue. And it's going to be a challenge in the Democratic Party, not in the Republican Party, in part because of evangelical Christian support for Israel. They're all in with whatever, Netanyahu wants to do.
And yet, Ben, let me just ask, I guess the question is, did you see any of these changes, the trend lines that you're talking about, reflected in Biden administration policy? I mean, they did seem to rely on those same outdated talking points.
Yeah.
They did block every UN Security Council statement that would have condemned what was going on there. They did not publicly call for an immediate ceasefire. So, and yet they did get a ceasefire, with the Egyptians and doing diplomacy in the region. So in terms of how the Biden administration handled this, are you seeing any changes at all?
Not really. And I was disappointed by that, Dan. I mean, I wasn't that surprised, to some extent, because I know the mindset of a White House. The mindset of a White House is don't put a lot of political capital in something that doesn't feel like it's going to get any better. We've got a massive domestic agenda we're trying to pass. We've got all kinds of things we're trying to do around the world. We don't want to be seen to be putting a lot of chips into the Israeli-Palestinian issue. That feels like a losing bet. I think what's frustrating to some respect for me is that at the end of the Obama administration, when, not only was Joe Biden there, but all the key foreign policy people for Biden were there, part of the reason we did that UN Security Council abstention, and John Kerry, if you remember, gave a speech in which for the first time we kind of publicly put out the U.S. position on final status issues, what is a two-state solution, and Jerusalem should be, two capitals for two peoples, that could be a baton that could be passed to the next Democratic administration. We knew that Trump wasn't going to take it, but they didn't do that. They didn't kind of go back to where we ended the Obama administration. They kind of went back to kind of 2009 status quo. And I think that's why you saw this kind of discordance between the progressive side of the party and the Biden team's response. And I think that's going to be something that they're going to have to continue to wrestle with because, it's not going away.
But what would you like to see done at this point in terms of a shift in U.S. policy? What kind of pressure can the United States credibly put on the Israeli government that's going to change the settlements policy, that's going to change its approach to Gaza or anything else? And at the same time, you do have Hamas there firing rockets into Israeli cities. I mean, what do you do about it?
So I want to preface this by saying this is really hard. I'm very sympathetic to these guys. It's much easier having sat in
really?
Yeah, I mean, having sat there for 8 years from January 20th, 2009 to January 20th, 17, I get it. That said, I'd throw a few things out there for consideration. One is Gaza itself. And absolutely Hamas is a threat to Israel. Absolutely Israel does not want to tolerate a terrorist group that fires rockets at its people. The problem that I see is that they've tried this kind of blockade strategy where you essentially just wall off Gaza from the world. You don't let goods get in there. There's no freedom of movement really for the people there. That is not harming Hamas. Like Hamas doesn't appear to be appreciably weaker today than it was kind of at the beginning of that blockade and through successive Gaza wars. It's hurt the Palestinian people. So on Gaza itself, I do think there's space, and I hope that this administration does try to begin to lift this blockade, try something different here for both humanitarian and kind of moral reasons, but also I think because the people of Gaza haven't had an alternative to Hamas, because they're basically walled off with Hamas in there. And so just trying to have a dramatic improvement in the circumstances for the people of Gaza is something we should be working on with the Israelis and with other partners, by the way. All these Gulf countries that, some of them did the Abraham Accords. Well, they have a lot of money. They could help rebuild Gaza as well, not just us. Then I think on these other questions about the Palestinian issue, I think the U.S. can be it can be more public in its positions. It can be open to the international community expressing its own positions, whether it's on something like a Gaza war. These don't have to be UN Security Council mandated resolutions to the actual two-state solution. I get why that should be negotiated. But the kind of wall that we provide diplomatically from any position being taken by the rest of the world on these issues doesn't seem to be, again, improving the circumstance. And then I think these assistance questions, one of the things that people like me were raising even during the campaign is, look, we're not going to cut off assistance to Israel. Like, there's a lot of reasons why we provide that security assistance. But, in other circumstances, we have requirements or conditions or kind of end use requirements that we don't want to see any U.S. assistance going to finance anything around settlement activity, or maybe not around certain kind of military actions in Gaza. These are the kinds of questions that I think people are raising because, look, if you look at our foreign military financing and assistance, Israel is like almost half the budget, this is we have a lot of skin in this game, almost $4 billion a year. Why are we preventing ourselves from doing the same thing we do anywhere in the world, which is where we have that kind of relationship, try to use it to encourage certain policies.
And what's the end game here? Because it used to be when I was covering these issues that we all talked about how, well, everyone at the end of the day knows, what the end game is. They know the basic contours of the peace deal. Israel gives up settlements except for those kind of suburbs around Jerusalem. There's a land swap for that. Jerusalem is shared. There's no right of return except for some symbolic number of Palestinians who go back to Jaffa and Haifa. You know all of this.
Yeah.
The assumption was a two-state solution. And now there is increasing talk of a binational state being taken seriously by some in the Democratic Party, by journalists and academics, Peter Beinart notably.
Yeah.
And of course, the third solution is expulsion.
Yes.
Right. So where are you on this? And where do you think future American administrations ought to be?
So, I still believe that a two-state solution is the best outcome, for the simple reason that while I see the arguments for kind of a binational state where everybody has equal rights, like, Dan, we can barely live together in this country as Republicans and Democrats, trying to envision going from this conflict for decades to that working, without severe disruptions and problems. Never mind, the identity issues, right, of the Jewish state versus, Palestinian state. But at the same time, the maps that I saw at the end of the Obama administration of where the Israeli settlements are, coupled with kind of the effort to kind of remake the demographics of Jerusalem, which is part of what instigated this last conflict, literally expelling Palestinians from neighborhoods in Jerusalem, is making that less and less viable. So, look, you're right. There's three options, right? There's only three ways this can go, because there are 7 million Palestinians living in the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. Either there's going to be two states, either there's going to be a binational state, or there's going to be some form of expulsion or kind of second-class citizenship for Palestinians who happen to be within what is increasingly a kind of greater Israel. The reality is where this is currently going is the two-state solution is going to slowly disappear as an option, and then you're really just going to be left with this kind of terrible choice between a binational state or expulsion. That's the reality that I think a lot of us are warning about here. So again, my preference is still two-state solution. I have to be honest about, I'm not sure how much longer that's going to be a credible argument if the settlements continue in the way that they have the last, decade or so.
So want to shift to another part of the world, which is what's going on in Belarus and their kind of pretty shocking breach of international norms last week when the government of Belarus forced a Ryanair flight flying over its airspace down and took a dissident off of the flight. The conflict there seems to be escalating even today. And my question is what happened in Belarus a harbinger of kind of increasing conflict and in degradation of these international norms? Or is it just kind of one of these small flurries of conflict that'll eventually we'll all forget within about 6 months that it ever happened?
Oh, no, I think it is very much an indicator of the broader challenge. And this does, this does tie to my book because I had to look very carefully at the 30 years that produced Vladimir Putin. And I kind of settled on this idea that what he's really been up to for quite some time now is a counter-revolution against the international order, against American influence. And he has kind of crossed every psychological barrier to, in terms of respecting norms, right? Normally you don't annex your neighbor's land as he did in Crimea. You don't have, a civilian airliner shot down over Ukraine from areas backed by Russian separatists that they may not have meant to shot down, but they certainly didn't own up to it. And they kind of obscured it and created a bunch of conspiracy theories about it. You certainly don't have them interfering as aggressively as they did, not just in our election, but all over the place. Recently, again, reports of, Russians paying French influencers to, tell people not to get the Pfizer vaccine. What is that about? That is about someone who is just trying to wreak havoc as a strategy of survival. And so why wouldn't we think that's going to lead to ever more brazen attacks on even pretty basic international norms? Like if I get in a plane in Greece to fly to Lithuania, it's not going to be grounded on a false pretense. So someone can be dragged off the plane and thrown in prison. And so I think we have to change kind of the scale of our response to these things to kind of catch up to the reality of what Putin is up to. Because I don't think that Lukashenko, does that, ground that plane without Russian knowledge.
Well, not just Putin. I mean, and this is not just a harbinger. This is the reality of the world we live in today, the violation of norms and the sort of, particularly by authoritarian leaders around the world. You and I talked last year for this series we have coming up on Conspiracy Land about Jamal Khashoggi, in which, the U.S. intelligence community concludes that Mohammed bin Salman was responsible for his gruesome murder. And yet very little consequence for him. The Biden administration came in, Biden said during the campaign, the Saudis will pay a price. They will be international pariahs. And yet when he had the chance to do something, there was like one additional sanction of a deputy chief of Saudi intelligence. But other than that, no sanctions against MBS, no serious cutback in dealings with the Saudis. Was that a disappointment to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, this ties back, and I'll get to the Saudis, this ties back to escalating the consequences because, part of the mentality of any White House, right, is that, do I want to kind of provoke more instability abroad by having more consequences on Saudis or by provoking Putin more? I think the reality, though, that we have to recognize is even if you don't, even if you're passive, they're still going to continue to push more and more. And the world is kind of bleeding into this authoritarian model of politics that runs counter to everything we care about, not just from a value standpoint, but increasingly our interests are implicated. So with like a Lukashenko, this guy's done. Like, we're not going to deal with them anymore. Him and all of his circle are just cut off from the United States, from the financial system, from traveling here. And we're going to support this opposition, not in like an overt regime change strategy, but just the basic point of like, this guy's not a legitimate president. He didn't win the election that he tried to steal. And now he's breaking every norm. And so this guy's cut off. Same thing with Mohammed bin Salman. Like I get that you're not going to take his wealth away. That guy's worth, over $1 trillion if you think about Saudi oil reserves and sovereign wealth fund. But, travel ban, like what does, why wouldn't you say that someone who orders a journalist to be chopped up in a consulate in a third country, why not say that person can't travel to the United States anymore? I mean, that kind of just even basic consequence, I think is something that a lot of us, would have supported. So, again, these are hard issues. I don't want to suggest, I always want to caveat as someone who knows what it was like to hear advice, from within the White House, but